what is right. External freedom is the freedom required to do what is right. So I'll call the freedom that enables us to do what is right freedom of agency. And I will, over the course of the lecture, use the term agency to distinguish it from choice, which I understand as the capacity to distinguish between different options. And the argument that I want to make today, and that I explore in the paper and in the lecture, which is part of a longer book project, is that capitalism structurally undermines our freedom of agency, even when it looks like it's respecting our freedom of choice. And I'll return to these distinctions. So I will define capitalism as a social structure that is characterized by private ownership of the most important means of production, and the sale of labor in exchange for wages, and the pursuit of profit as a central incentive. And on this very general definition, people like Marx, Max Weber, Schumpeter, Rawls, even Hayek would actually agree. So I hope you will agree as well. To understand why capitalism undermines freedom of agency, we need to return to this idea that freedom is that which we experience in the moment of moral responsibility, when we ask ourselves, what should I do? What ought I do? And so, to be free on this account, connected to moral responsibility, isn't just to do whatever you feel like or whatever strikes your fancy, but it is to be able to take a critical distance from your whims, your feelings, your inclinations, your passions, all of that sort of thing, and to ask yourself, well, is it reasonable? And so that reflects what someone like Adam Smith, for example, called enlightened thinking in the theory of moral sentiments, not in the Wealth of Nations. And he calls this attitude the attitude of, I quote, the man within. Is always a man, but we can say the human being within. And what the human being within, Smith says, is the inhabitant of the breast, the great judge and arbiter of our conduct. So this idea that we have this kind of internal moral voice that is the voice of consciousness that asks itself, okay, I feel like doing this, but should I do this really? And actually, literature and art are full of examples that explain this distinction and refer to it constantly. So think about Mozart's opera, think about the character of Don Giovanni. In the opera and in the story, the character is presented to us as a character whose passion for seduction turns out not to be liberating, but a case of tyranny of the instincts. Or think about another character from Dickens, this time from the novella A Christmas Carol, which begins by telling us about Ebenezer Scrooge, a character who finds Christmas oppressive and thinks that the accumulation of money is actually what gives him freedom. And so famously, Scrooge in that novel says, what is Christmas time to you? I know it's not very Christmassy atmosphere, but just think about Christmas spirit. What is Christmas time to you? He asks his nephew, Fred, but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older, but not an hour richer. So that's his imperative, is to just make money, and the spirit of Christmas and the love and the warmth and the affection, this is all meaningless. But of course, by the end of the novella, Scrooge discovers that his passion for money was not freedom, but addiction. And that actually he has missed out on one of the most important and valuable components of life, like community, and all the things that come with community, like solidarity and human connection. So this capacity that we all have to take a critical distance from our immediate preferences is a core aspect of what I'm trying to hint at by talking about the difference between apparent freedom and authentic freedom. On this account, there is a difference between this apparent freedom and this authentic freedom. I am authentically free, not to the extent that I can choose between different options, so not to the extent that I think of freedom as just freedom of choice. Do I pick white or black, or do I buy Levi's jeans or this other kind of jeans? But to the extent that my decisions are made in a way that is free from fear, from need, from bias, from prejudice, from manipulation, and so on, so freedom of agency. And so to return to Adam Smith and the man with him, freedom of agency is what enables me to channel that human being within in my decision, and to pursue my ends in a framework of reflexive distance from these immediate impulses, and to follow what Smith and others consider to be the core of our moral compass. So we can call this human being within the almost like the anti-Elon Musk or whatever, because if you see how Elon Musk behaves on Twitter, that's almost the opposite of everything that I've just described. You just see tweets every time it strikes his fancy and doesn't really think about what he's tweeting and so on. So I think this freedom of agency is exactly what capitalist structures undermine. And to start explaining this point, it's worth thinking about tensions in the experience of freedom by exploring the different ways in which we talk about it. Or to put it differently, we can start by thinking about the contrast between the notion of freedom of agency that is at the heart of this account and the way in which capitalist structures undermine freedom of agency by conflating it with freedom of choice, so just picking between these different options. So think about the example of freedom of movement and why it's so controversial in political discourse. When Musk and Trump make calls, this paper was written when Musk and Trump were still friends, so now I can just say when Trump makes calls to crack down on migration, they see the problem of migration as just a problem of choice. So the choice to go from place A to place B, which is made in the context of an institutional framework based on which the people who cross borders in an unauthorized way act wrongly. Why do they think people who cross borders in an unauthorized way act wrongly? Because they think that irregular migrants break the rules. So what do? They jump the queue, they impose themselves unilaterally in a host community, they strain the resources of liberal states, so they make the wrong choice in the context of a justified background of institutional structures in which other choices are possible for them to be made. So, on my account of freedom, the problem posed by migration isn't the choice to go from A to B, but whether it promotes or hinders the capacity to set and to pursue moral ends in the world in which everyone has the same ability. So here structural constraints play a crucial enabling or disabling role in the exercise of that capacity. And actually, if you think about migration as just a problem of choice and just a freedom of choice, then Donald Trump actually is right. Because at a very superficial level, the migrant who pays the smuggler to cross the Mediterranean does have freedom of choice. There's lots of options that are presented to him, so he has the choice of A, not going anywhere, just staying at home, B, paying someone to cross the sea on a dinghy, C, to apply for a visa and wait and see if he can get one and go in that more regularized way, or D, do something else. So that migrant, if you think of it as just a problem of selecting between different options, doesn't just have one choice, he seems to have 4 choices. And he could pick between each of these choices from A to D. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, can that migrant set and pursue their moral ends in the world as it is presented to them? And so an appropriately reformulated analysis of freedom of movement, understood as freedom of agency, would say the following. The problem of irregular migration is not that it reflects a wrongful choice, as Trump would want to convince you, but it is also not that exclusion at the border violates an unconditional right to freedom of movement, whether between these 4 options to cross or not to cross must be a legal priority, as the liberal critics would insist. So it's not the question as Trump poses it, but also not the question as liberals pose it, which is we just have freedom of movement, because that's also just an option. It's also understood as a freedom of choice. I have the choice to move, and that choice should be respected, and so the problem is posed just as a question of freedom of movement. The way I'm formulating it, the problem has to be raised in a context in which we reflect on our freedom of agency,